Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and this is a video that's going to continue off of a previous video where we were looking at comparing a perfectly competitive market to monopoly and comparing price versus quantity. Also, we can get into the discussion of allocative and productive efficiency. And in that first video, I illustrated the perfectly competitive industry in graph A, along with the individual perfectly competitive firm in graph B, compared to graph C, the monopolist. And some students have asked, is it necessary to draw the three models together? No. To make it simple, we can just illustrate industry with monopoly or the firm with monopoly and make these comparisons. So in this video, we're going to compare perfect competition industry to the monopoly. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's erase what we don't need and start a little bit from scratch so that on an exam, you're not intimidated to draw three models side by side. So graph A will be the industry for perfect competition. We're measuring price, cost, revenue on the y-axis, the quantity of the output of that more than likely primary commodity on the x-axis. We have the supply of all of the individually perfectly competitive firms supplying into a global market, let's say, could be the global market for coffee. And then we have the demand likely by firms for those key inputs to produce some type of output, like Nestle demanding cacao or coffee to produce either chocolate or some types of roasted coffee product. Their demand curve relatively inelastic. There's no close substitute. So the supply in the industry connects or intersects with the demand. S1, D1 equals each other at point A, providing the price that all firms must accept, price for perfect competition, and the quantity of all of the perfectly competitive firms, the quantity being supplied and demanded at QPC. All right, now let's draw the monopoly next to that. So here we're going to illustrate graph B being the monopolist. We're going to have our y-axis and our x-axis. For the monopolist, again, we're measuring price, costs of production, and revenue. We're measuring the quantity of output by the monopolist, and we got to label this as graph B, illustrating the monopoly. And for the monopolist, we're going to illustrate our supply curve. But before we do that, on an exam, I would recommend that you have your price set by the industry for perfect competition, price at PC, and then draw that line all the way across. All right, let's draw that line all the way across, like you see here. And we want to label that, again, this is the price for the perfectly competitive firm, which is equal to the average revenue for the perfectly competitive firm, which is equal to the demand curve for the perfectly competitive firm, which is also equal to the marginal benefit curve for the perfectly competitive firm, which is also equal to the marginal revenue curve for the perfectly competitive firm. So we know that in perfect competition, price is equal to the average revenue, equal to demand, equal to marginal benefit, also equal to the marginal revenue. Now let's go ahead and draw the supply curve for the monopolist. It's going to have a backwards J shape due to the law of diminishing marginal returns. So it goes down, then the law of diminishing marginal returns sets in. Here we have S2 for the monopolist, which is equal to the marginal costs of production 2. So we can distinguish the two supply curves, S1 for perfect competition in the industry, S2 for the monopolist. Then we're going to have our demand curve intersecting at this point, demand curve relatively inelastic because of the monopolist's market power. So here we have D2 equal to the marginal benefit 2. Fine. So here we have, we'll call that point B, where S2 equals D2. And we're going to highlight that that would be the quantity of output for the perfectly competitive firm, right? So the monopolist is the industry. If it's one dominating firm facing no competition, the monopolist is the industry. So essentially, the perfectly competitive industry model is the same as the monopolist model because they're both illustrating the industry. So again, the quantity at PC is exactly the same as the quantity here. It illustrates the level of output by the perfectly competitive firm in the monopoly model, so we can compare it to where the monopolist actually produces at. So let's now illustrate the marginal revenue curve. We have the MR curve. Let's say it goes down to this point. We'll call it MR1, marginal revenue curve 1. And following the rule of profit maximization, which we see here, the monopolist will produce where the MR curve is equal to the MC curve, which is at this point. MR equals MC right here. So that will determine the level of output. So we're going to illustrate that with another color. Let's use, I guess, this color. So output is set here, and then it goes straight up to the demand curve. This will become the price that the monopolist will charge. So I'll label it PM, price from monopolist, and then this will be the quantity being produced by the monopolist at QM. Okay, and again, we want to remember that this is the price for the perfectly competitive firm. So I've effectively finished drawing this, and I can label these points, point B, let's say I'll label this point C, and this will be point D. And I can highlight the welfare loss that's generated by the monopolist. Okay, it's this triangular area here between points B, C, and D. So there we see the welfare loss. And I can just make a mental note to myself that point C is highlighting the marginal benefit. Here I can see the marginal benefit. Oops. The marginal benefit at point C is greater than, this is my supply curve, the marginal cost. So at QM, MB is greater than MC, so we see that the monopolist under allocates. Okay. So in my exam, when I've drawn this, I can then emphasize the price and quantity differences between them. So in graph A, it's illustrating the industry for perfect competition, measuring the quantity of output on the x-axis, price, cost, revenue on the y-axis. I have the upward sloping supply curve, S1 equal to MC, the sum of all perfectly competitive firms in the industry. I have the downward sloping demand curve, all firms demanding those inputs in that industry. The intersection of S1 equals D1 provides a price that all firms must accept at price PC, saying the quantity of output in the industry at QPC, which is the same price that we see illustrated in graph B. That perfectly elastic curve is the price that all perfectly competitive firms must accept, which is equal to the average revenue, which is equal to the perfectly competitive firm's demand curve, equal to the marginal benefit curve, equal to the marginal revenue curve. And here with the monopolist in graph B, we're measuring the same things on the x and the y-axis. We have the upward sloping supply curve for the monopolist, the downward sloping demand curve for the monopolist. Where S2 equals D2, it provides an equilibrium at point B, which is the same as graph A, so the same price that all firms must accept for perfect competition, and the same quantity that all firms will produce in the industry at QPC. But the monopolist seeks to profit maximize, so they're going to produce where MR equals MC. The intersection of MR equals MC occurs at point D, setting the quantity for the monopolist at QM. The monopolist will price according to their demand curve at point C, so we see a price of PM. So with the monopolist, we see that the monopolist charges a higher price. The monopolist's price of PM is greater than the perfectly competitive firm's price of PC. And we can also see that the monopolist produces less than the industry for perfect competition. We see that the quantity of the monopolist at QM is less than the quantity produced by all firms in the industry for perfect competition at QPC. So this means that the monopolist underallocates. All right, we see that at QM, the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, generating a welfare loss, which is the shaded area here between points B, C, and D. All right, so with the IB guide, we've illustrated a model comparing price and quantity for perfect competition and monopoly. In the third and final video here, we're going to illustrate the individual firm compared to the monopolist. All right, and if you have any questions, feel free to comment. Don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.